We're going to talk about SharePoint 2013 as a development platform. As you know, SharePoint as a development platform has really been around since SharePoint 2003. So Microsoft has had 10 years to refine this, and it keeps getting better and better and better. But because of that, so much has been added to the product that it intimidates a lot of people. So there's many different customization options. You can change sites, you can add sites through the browser, you can add data through the browser. There's different tools you can use. You can use SharePoint Designer, you can use Visual Studio. So all those types of tools like SharePoint Designer and the browser, those would be considered to be user and power user features. And then there's also tools for designers and administrators. So things like PowerShell scripting would be something an administrator would do, and designer would be using SharePoint Designer to maybe work on master pages or doing some styling. And then for developers, there's just a huge amount of different APIs that you can call. So both on the server itself, where you actually deploy code on the server side, and then also web service APIs. And in fact, in this version of SharePoint, lots of different web service APIs have been added. Pretty much anything that you can do in the browser can all be done through a web service call now. In most environments, they're going to use all these blocks because lots of different people touch SharePoint. So you might have designers designing pages with SharePoint Designer, or you may have obviously developers making custom solutions using Visual Studio, and then your power users. They might be going out and adding data or creating pages, creating and editing content. So all of these features that we just talked about, they all encompass a smaller set of underlying features that the developers leverage. So everything that users were doing with the browser or that a designer was doing through SharePoint Designer, they're all calling the same APIs that the developers are going to be using when they write code. So, for example, updating the title on a site, you might go into the browser and go to the description of a site and change the title, whereas a developer might go through the object model and find the object for the site and set its title property and then go ahead and update it. So what makes a classic SharePoint application? Well, the server-side applications that get deployed in SharePoint are called solutions. Now, there are other types. In SharePoint 2013, there are what are called apps. We're going to be focusing on server-side applications here, and these are called solutions. And these solutions are standalone for broad purpose. They're composed of many different components, and they can be reused in other solutions. And solutions provide a consistent deployment model for developers and administrators. So previously, maybe you in the olden days you were working on an ASP.NET application, and maybe the deployment model would be just to copy the files to a server and then run the database setup, or change the web config file to point to the correct database. Well, in SharePoint, it's a little bit different because a lot of times you're going to have a server farm. In large SharePoint installations, you may have like 20 servers. So there needed to be a way for developers and administrators to deploy these solutions in a repeatable way. And so that's what SharePoint solutions cover. They handle getting your functionality deployed out to the whole entire farm in a consistent way. And then all these solutions utilize the services of the platform to deliver complete sets of functionality. So you might be delivering data, you might be delivering executing code, or maybe one or the other, but all of that is all wrapped up into your solution. So SharePoint provides us with a complete set of services for modeling. We can model both data and content. We can manipulate that data and content. And it gives us a way to store the data and content. The underlying mechanisms that make this happen are Windows File Services and SQL Server. And these details are invisible to users, and they're also abstract to the developers. So typically, an ASP.NET developer would worry about probably database design and worry about making calls to the database. But when you're dealing with SharePoint, that's not what you want to do. What you want to do is deal with the API. So whatever API you're calling, you don't really care how the data is stored. SharePoint's going to take care of that for you. And so kind of just like, today when you're programming against services, maybe you're programming against Amazon Web Services or, programming against any type of external web service. Maybe it's SkyDrive. Maybe you're going to store files in SkyDrive programmatically. Well, you really don't know where that's being stored at, but you do know that you're calling an API, and it's the same thing with SharePoint development. You're going to talk to an API that's going to work with that data. And there's different ways of doing that in SharePoint. We have the CAML, which is more for kind of how the structure of the data is. So think of CAML as like the SQL that you would write for designing a database table, only in this case you might be designing a list. Then there's also managed code through SharePoint, through the SharePoint object model. So Microsoft.SharePoint.dll is the root assembly that all SharePoint solutions are based off of. And then there's external ways of dealing with it. So maybe you're calling into SharePoint from JavaScript, you could be calling it from web services, and then there's also several managed libraries that talk to those services. And so the services we're talking about here are the services that SharePoint exposes. So they have SOAP services, REST services, and they're all talking to the same object model underneath. It's just different ways of getting there. So some of the things the APIs support, we can deploy data and content, the definition and management of data structures. So we can do things like we can provision a list. So that would be a deployment of data and content. And then if we wanted some content or data to be in that list, well, we could also deploy that. And the definition and management of those data structures. So we could decide what fields we want to have in our list. And that could be part of what we design and deploy. We can retrieve data. We can put data into SharePoint and we can get it out all through the APIs. Well, all the data and content that we have in SharePoint really are useless without some way to view and manipulate it. Well, SharePoint gives us lots of options on building web UIs. We can do the standard ASP.NET, which will be deployed right inside SharePoint Server. Or it could be external. We could write an external ASP.NET website that's talking to SharePoint services. We can build just a real simple page inside SharePoint and then add JavaScript to it, and the JavaScript could be performing some type of functions. You can make a Silverlight client, info path. Pretty much the service APIs allow any kind of client. So whatever you're working on, you could be working on a PHP web application, or you could be a Windows Form application, WPF, doesn't matter. Now that SharePoint has all these services that's exposing all the data, you can build whatever you want on top of those services. Windows Phone is another good example. And like I was saying, non-Windows platforms, besides PHP, you can build Android apps, iOS apps. So one of the nice things that SharePoint provides us as a platform is it gives us a good security platform. We don't need to build that in our applications because SharePoint gives that to us. Now, past versions of SharePoint, they did include authentication and authorization systems, but they were heavily integrated with Windows and ASP.NET. SharePoint 2010 got a little bit better, and they use what's called Windows Identity Foundation. And what that does, what Windows, or what's also called as WIF, the goal of WIF was to externalize authentication completely where possible and remove dependencies between the the authentication mechanism that identifies the user, and then the authorization system that will control the user's level of access. So it's externalizing authentication and removing that coupling between authentication and authorization. SharePoint 2010 also supports claims-based authentication via Windows Identity Foundation. And claims-based authentication supports integrated Windows authentication, forms-based authentication, and single sign-on scenarios. So the benefit is that it can support all of those in a single site simultaneously, and it makes it easy to support new kinds of authentication mechanisms as long as those mechanisms support one of a variety of open standards. So in 2013, more improvements were made to claims-based authentication. So claims is the way that everything is going right now, and SharePoint has definitely embraced that. And SharePoint 2013 has also added support for OAuth. And so OAuth is an open standard for authorization. It's a method for clients to access server resources on behalf of a resource owner, such as a different client or an end user. And it provides a process for end users to authorize third-party access to their server resources without sharing their credentials. So usually it's a username and a password pair, but it could just be a token that gets sent in the header. But the nice thing about SharePoint is that yes, we support all these types of authentication and authorization, but SharePoint has put all of this into an SP user class for developers. So in the SP user class, we can get access to everything that we need to about a user's rights, what they have access to, and then we can program against that. So the benefit for developers is that a standard authorization system based on claims that work with no knowledge of the security configuration. So the developer can use the standard .NET iPrincipal and iIdentity interfaces, and then there's also the new iClaims principal and iClaims identity interfaces that can be used to discover information about the current user. But the good thing is that the code to control the authorization settings and perform the authorization in SharePoint is independent of the authentication model. So what this means is when you use the SharePoint class SP user, you really don't have a requirement to understand ahead of time how that SP user instance came to exist. You just know that it's there, and you can see what rights that user has, and you can use that in your application to produce security-trimmed menus, security-trimmed data and content. SharePoint platform also has several background services. And what I mean by that is there's lots of things that aren't conducive to running within the context of a web page, or they don't require any user interactions. So an example might be search. When content is being indexed or crawled by the search crawler, the user doesn't really care or doesn't need to know, doesn't need to be involved in that. We just need it to happen. We can go ahead and do our searches later, but that index was built in a different process offline, so not taking up the resources that the web application would, serving up a web pages might need. Some other services are business connectivity services that allow you to connect to remote data sources. Word automation services, so doing things like converting documents in the background. There's many more. SharePoint includes a service application framework that you can actually create your own service applications and create facilities that allow administrators to create, monitor, and manage instances of custom service applications. And this is done through a service application framework. where you build and deploy administrative and configuration pages. There's also, in addition to these service applications, are what are called SP timer jobs. And so if you had a business process where you needed to do some type of maintenance or some type of data need to be pulled in on a regular basis, you could build a timer job, and the timer job would get executed within the framework of SharePoint. So when accessing the APIs for SharePoint, if you're just writing code that's going to be running in the context of SharePoint, within the context of a SharePoint page or a web part with C# or VB.NET, all you really need to do is just reference whatever SharePoint assemblies that you need, and then you can create the functionality with ASP.NET or in a service application. But if you're writing code that's going to be running outside of SharePoint, then that's when you need to call into the service APIs for SharePoint. And SharePoint has several different kinds. There's traditional SOAP services, Windows Communication Foundation services. The SOAP services are still in 2013. So when I say SOAP services, I'm talking about the .asmx, ASMX web services. And those are still there, but they're being deprecated. And WCF services are represented by the client.svc endpoint. And so that's what is being used going forward. That's where all the new features were added to SharePoint 2010, and that's where all the new API features have been added for SharePoint 2013. Now, one of the things that the client.svc endpoint does is not only does it represent the data for the APIs in XML format, but it's also representing it in, it could be either JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, or the Atom feed format for publishing. And it's all done through the same client.svc endpoint because it's using Windows Communication Foundation. It can detect what the request is coming in and determine what type of data should be coming out. Now there's also WebDAV, and that's still supported in SharePoint 2013, but that's also being deprecated as well. So the way moving forward is you want to use either the managed APIs. So the managed APIs that ship with SharePoint basically wrap those WCF services. You could talk to the services directly, but I don't recommend that. REST would be the way to go if you're talking from a client that's on a non-Windows platform. So whenever you access a SharePoint site with any kind of client application, including the browser, you are accessing a site collection. And that site collection contains the site that you are trying to get to. And site collection is going to contain one top level or what's called a root web, and it could have 0 or more subsites. And site collection is the root unit of authorization for all the webs that it contains, and it's going to live underneath a web application. So think of it as it's a security boundary for all the data inside that site collection. So it has its own set of groups, and its data is only within that site collection. It's also a boundary for queries where you're querying against lists and documents with the out-of-the-box web parts. So if you're trying to do a query where you want to query against data in other site collections, you need to use, that's where search comes in, because search can be, search has an index that indexes everything, and you can call search APIs, and then you can get whatever data you want. But when you're trying, getting specific data out of lists, your boundary is going to be that site collection. So let's take a look at typical site hierarchy within a site collection. Site collection is basically, when some people think of a site collection, they may think of okay, I have a site, and then it contains my web, and then each of the subwebs are falling under my main web, MyCorp. But that's actually not correct. It's actually more like this. Site collection contains everything, and we still have a root web. So that root web is the web that's at the top of the hierarchy, and then it can have subwebs, but they're all enclosed inside the single site collection, so that they're all sharing the same security groups, and they're all sharing the same data. And so what that allows you to do is you can actually partition data with site collections. So you can have a site that, in this example, will have mycorp.com, and that would be the root site collection. So that would have your root web, mycorp.com, and then that could contain the HR subsite and the help desk subsite. But then let's say, for example, accounting has some sensitive data that they don't want people with who have the same authorization in the MyCorp site collection to see. So they can basically create their own security boundary by putting all of their sites and data in a new site collection. So in this case, it would be under a new site collection, and the root web would be mycorp.com/accounting. So in this demo, we're going to look at the best ways to understand the difference between site collections and webs. So we're going to jump in. We're going to go to Central Administration. And by default, when you install SharePoint, it's going to add a default web application and a default site collection. So we'll take a look at that. So I'm going to go into Application Management, and I'm going to view all site collections. And you can see here, this is a site collection that I created, and it's called My Team Site. So click OK, and I'm going to go back, and that is the only site collection in this web application. So I'm going to go to navigate to that site collection, and this is what you get by default. So I've created a team site. So this is actually, if I go here to the site settings, this is the root site of the root site collection. It's the only site inside the site collection. So you can see here I have commands for site collection administration as well as site administration. Because of that, this site is both a subsite and the root site. So I'm going to go back, go to Site Contents. I'm going to add a new subsite, and I'll just call it My Subsite. I'll call it My Subsite for the URL, and I'll base it on the team site template. I'm going to use the same permissions as the parent site, so you can actually, when you're creating subsites, if you want to not inherit the permissions of the site collection, you could do that. It's not recommended, but you could actually choose Use Unique Permissions, and what that would do would be it would copy all of the same security groups that you have in the site collection into your site, and then you could do whatever you want with them. And I can choose here if I want to display this site on the quick launch of the parent site, or if I want to display it on the top link bar of the parent site. I want it to display on the top link bar of the parent site. And then if I want to use the top link bar from the parent site, I'll say no. So this is going out right now and creating a new site, a subsite of the root site. So we have a root site called My Team Site Collection, and now we're going to have a subsite underneath it called My Subsite. And so you can see here, all I have is the top link bar here just for my subsite. So if I go into, let's say for example, I'm going to add something and I want to go back to my root, I can get back to my root here, but that's not the root of the site collection. So what we could do is go to the site settings and go to look and feel, go to top link bar, and I can say use links from parent. And now notice how I'm back to the root of my subsite, and now I can see my team site. So my team site also has this subsite in its top link bar as well. And so if I go into my team site, go to site settings, you can see here I have site collection administration. But if I go to my subsite, and let's go to the site settings there, notice how I don't have that anymore. I have site administration, site actions, and then here I just have, now I have a link to go to the top level site settings.